Hey, y'all. This is Sam Chavez with the Roots of Change podcast. And I am really excited to kick off Pride with my friend Honey Mahogany. Honey, we are talking about Indigenous queer history, and I'm really excited to talk to you specifically about that. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Super excited about the subject. So glad that we're kicking Pride season off with that.
Yes. As we said, we are trying to bring some joy into Pride Month while also talking about the real challenges that it takes to be a queer person today and across history. So, Honey, just to give the viewers and listeners a little recap of you, you are what I like to say a woman of many talents. You are an activist, political leader, drag performer, and singer. I love that you got your master's of social work at UC Berkeley, and then you went on to co-found the Transgender District in San Francisco. You also starred on RuPaul's Drag Race season 5. Have to add that for the Pride Month enthusiasts. And then you just stepped down, right, as the chairwoman of the SF Democratic Central Committee.
Yeah, yeah. I just like to say San Francisco Democratic Party.
There's too many DCCs in there, so CCCC. And then you also reopened the Stud this year, which is exciting.
Oh my God. Yeah, so excited that finally happened. I mean, we were shut down after the pandemic and looking for a home, but finally we found a place and it feels really good.
Well, I am not a party gay, but I appreciate that you have that for the party gays out there. And like I said, I'm really excited to talk to you about Indigenous queer history. We're covering it on the newsletter, and I really like how we have very different backgrounds, but we have similar parallels in our queer history and our journeys. You are born and raised in San Francisco to Ethiopian immigrants. You are a trans woman. And you also went to Catholic school.
Yeah.
Which is that's the similarity for me too, growing up in Episcopalian school and being very in that kind of colonial Christian view in school, but then also being queer and Indigenous yourself.
Yeah.
So first, how did you get into learning about queer history, and then how has that shaped you?
Yeah, I mean, I think we actually may have touched on some queer history in high school. I mean, yes, I went to Catholic high school, but it was Jesuit and fairly progressive. And one of the teachers who was teaching us at that time, I think, put pictures up around their classroom of LGBTQ people, right? Amidst a lot of other people, but that was pretty surprising to me. And growing up in the graduated high school in the very early aughts. So, it was a different time, and people didn't oftentimes talk about queerness openly in schools, in high school, especially a Catholic high school. So I got a little bit of exposure there. That being said, I mean, I think people assume that because I grew up in San Francisco, I had this sort of wild childhood where I got to experience all the queer things and went to the Castro every weekend, and that just wasn't the case. I was very sheltered on the West Side, and I think when I really started to dig deeper into my queerness, my transness, um, my yeah, I think that was probably in college, during my college experience. And, I think it initially was getting involved with every single LGBTQ organization I possibly could.
Yeah.
And then, I majored in psychology, which I feel like was a way of me also sort of self-counseling myself and figuring out why are people the way they are? And I, studied gender and sexuality, and I think I also explored it in through theater and different things, all the typical ways that we I think explore who we are. But when I went to graduate school, I went to graduate school for social work at Cal, and I was continuing to work within the queer community. One thing that I think really fascinated me for a variety of reasons was gender identity. And so I really I think I really wanted to explore I think I really wanted to explore the different ways in which um, gender diversity existed, right? Because I never found myself fitting into any sort of box. Yeah, and so I wanted to better understand, my own gender journey and see if there were sort of like echoes throughout history or culture that um, I could look to.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes total sense. And I feel like that is a part of like a lot of queer people's journey is to like look back in time. Especially like for me growing up in Dallas and not seeing a lot of representation, like it didn't occur to me that I was a lesbian until later in life, because I just didn't have that representation. And I think exploring Indigenous queer culture and digging into that as someone who has New Mexican ancestors is really fascinating because it's almost like coming back home to a queerness that was already deep inside me, but was obscured because of the cultures that we grew up in. So that's really cool that you found that in college. How did that help like shape your Ethiopian identity?
Oh yeah, that's interesting actually. I mean, Ethiopia is is kind of it's an interesting country because it was one of the first officially Christian nations in the world. So like going back to yeah, it was actually I think Armenia or at that time, Armenia, Turkey um, was the first Christian country, and then Ethiopia was the second. And so it predates a lot of Western sort of Christianity, and so a lot of and before that, a lot of Ethiopia, I think was presumably Jewish. And so there's a very long history within the Abrahamic sort of traditions. Um, and certainly there are still to this day, and obviously were some other more like indigenous, I think, religions that were a part of the region. But it just there's literally thousands of years of history of Christianity, Judaism, etc. Islam as well. It's like Ethiopia currently is I think something like 40% Muslim. Um, so in some ways, like I also grew up in a house of immigrants. My parents were refugees. They came to this country, and so in many ways, and my grandmother who lived a fascinating life, lived with us part time and like helped raise me and my brother, and so I always felt very connected to my Ethiopian culture. But what I actually found interesting was, just maybe like a decade ago, I read sort of a queer history of Africa or excerpts from it, and it actually talked about Ethiopia and the ways in which, I it's fascinating because I think as we look back on the ways in which gender diversity existed, sometimes it was still really fucked up. It was oftentimes still like based in like misogyny or like different like really like problematic I think concepts. Um, so allegedly, per my recollection, there was a time in Ethiopia's history where, well, there were certainly many kingdoms. Ethiopia is a place with like, something like 72 languages, and within the Ethiopian, it was a kind of an empire. Um, there were many sort of fiefdoms or kingdoms, and um, in some of these cultures, basically the palace was an area that was off limits to women, cisgender women. And because, women were considered, unclean or unworthy, I don't know, or a distraction. Like there were all sorts of assumptions as to why like women were not allowed in those spaces. But because there were no women, in these spaces, they basically had like certain, again, assigned male at birth people who fulfilled the roles of women within those spaces, both socially and sexually. And so it was, so there was an acceptance of that. There was or I should say, there was a place for people who were gender nonconforming within that societal structure, even if it was like, again, within these sort of like weird, social constructs that seems anti-woman to me looking back at it. But, again, I don't really know. I'm not an expert on that. Unfortunately, I wish I was. I need to go back and dig more into that. But yeah. I mean, and we see this kind of like echoing throughout, I think, different cultures where I think there is that gender diversity, and sometimes it is in response, I think, to um, maybe issues of the time, and also sometimes a response into the ways in which people cope with misogyny.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting because it's parallel but different to like the Americas and how indigenous societies were much more matriarchal. And yet, like the male assigned at birth, like in a lot of indigenous cultures, we now refer to them as two spirit, served such an important like spiritual and religious role within the community because they were across genders. Like people born as women became warriors. People born as males became caretakers. I really love that, like that trans and queer folks are really like the central glue to the indigenous cultures within a lot of the Americas. And how when like the colonial times and like all the Europeans came over, we saw that they used queerness to vilify queerness to then take over. So a lot of it was really using gender to empower white supremacy, essentially. And how like the trans woman essentially was like kind of the main fear tactic for the Europeans.
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw that in West Africa as well, an area where there were, you know, definitely more than two genders in some cultures, and where that was shown as, or, highlighted as a sign of, um, you know, uh, not being civilized, right?
Yeah.
And truthfully, I think, there's well documented studies or rather, I think analyses of the history of gender within Western culture that shows that like sort of the ways in which femininity are defined, women being, careless and having to look a certain way and like all of these different things and even women's hygiene, like all of that comes from this sort of idea of creating a separateness of like, white civility and femininity versus like brown and black, like, bestiality or, animalisticness or whatever, more, and it's identifying that as being more primitive and less, um, defined in a binary by their gender roles and more, amorphic.
Yeah. Yeah, that part is so interesting to me because it's like the view of mostly men, we'll say white supremacist men, that talk about the like progress of society as like we go from the savages to the civilized, and like that's just not what it is. And we're beginning to reawaken to that, I think, of using indigenous cultures, using cultures from around the world to build something that's better than what is right now. So to get into the gender joy of it all, like where, how do you see like using your understanding of indigenous queer history, like what do you use about that to empower yourself now and empower others in their gender journey?
Well, I think that like for me, it's interesting because I have to, especially right now, fight back against so much of the negative, the vitriol, the misinformation, and sort of the attacks on our civil rights. I've, been outspoken about that, obviously, through social media and things like that. But I'm also asked, in person, in real life, whether it be through my activism in the Democratic Party or like, being, randomly being on a Belgian TV show where they're asking me about like trans rights. I'm in a position where I have to talk about being trans all the time and again, like people always operate from this framework, at least when coming from the right or when questioning or even attacking the trans community from a framework of this is something that is new or, when did this become acceptable or why is this happening now and it hasn't happened before when in fact it has demonstrably happened many, many times throughout our history, arguably since the beginning of time and humanity, predating humanity even, that there has been gender diversity. And we see it reflected through many, many societies. And that in and of itself is empowering because, it shows that, this is natural, that it's, an expression of nature and that, that we have a place. And it expands across, again, like sex and gender and culture. I think oftentimes we talk about like, indigenous when we think of like black and brown people, but like there are also indigenous European cultures that also, have trans people, or trans elements to their culture. Like in Eastern Europe and like Albania, there was oh my gosh, what they called the sworn virgins. I forget what the actual name for them was. There's like a Romanian name for it, but or a Albanian name for it. But basically, people who are assigned female at birth at a time when, women were incredibly, disempowered, I should say, were incredibly limited by society's rules. So women couldn't inherit property, they couldn't drink, they couldn't, be in certain places. Like I mean, I guess that's I don't know. Anyway, like just a lot of really like great, horrible things, definitely making women second class citizens. In fact, if a woman was killed and a score was to be settled, she'd only be counted as like half a person versus a man would be counted as a full person, right? So in this environment, there were what they called sworn virgins, which were people who were assigned female at birth who swore to live a life of celibacy and live within the male role and never go back. And so after swearing in front of, I think, a panel of like 12 village elders, they would from then on be referred to as male and enjoy all the rights of all of the male privileges. So they could own property, they could, drink, they could, sit with a group of and talk with a group of men, like all of these things. Um, and then also like if they were killed, they would also be counted as a full person. Like, it's so wild, right? I mean, like, and so this existed even within, like, again, like European culture. And there may be many other ways in which trans people exist in European culture, but it's just this sort of idea of like when we talk about Western culture, I think we talk about like Judeo-Christian, you know, Western culture, colonialist, white supremacist culture.
No, I appreciate that because I think like going back to like the fear factor of how and why like trans women are so terrifying to the patriarchy and white supremacy today and back then is like that fear of the expansive. It's like, no, we have to have these guardrails, we have to have these two genders because we need to control society. And like we're learning now that that was never what it was, and that we do need to go back to that expansiveness and allow people to live their lives on maybe not even a spectrum, it might be outside of the spectrum entirely.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it really, and I know I'm not like specifically talking about the joy of this, but I think there is a joy in like being able to express your truth and not just your truth, but I think like the truth, which is that, I think that a lot of, again, like white supremacy, patriarchy, all of these things are based on the lie that, being like male or being a white male in particular is like the penultimate and like everyone, that is the shining example on the hill that everyone should be like, either if you're not like trying to achieve that, then you are like subject to that, right? I mean, and when I think trans women and especially trans women of color are like, no, that's not who we are and that's not who we want to be. In fact, we're fine with who we are and we want to celebrate ourselves and go in a different direction. Um, that like shakes the foundation, I think, of that lie. And without a shared goal or a shared understanding of like what is um, to be aspired to, I think, yeah, there is a lot of, you're right, there's a lot of fear around, how do we control people? Um, And I find personally a lot of joy, in looking at other cultures where trans people are not just accepted but celebrated. So like I love hearing about, you know, trans people like Fa'afafine and Pakaleti of like, American Samoa and the way in which they are seen as caretakers and embraced as, um, parts of society and accepted and children are not like because I mean as a child I was definitely told a lot like don't play with the girls, don't boys don't do that or whatever, all these things. And that is less common um in American Samoa, at least um in families that sort of I think embrace some of the more traditional values because there's an understanding that there is a role for people who are assigned male at birth but don't necessarily like fit into the box of what it means to be a man.
Yeah.
um and then like when you look at certainly I think the hijras of India, like they face a lot of discrimination and there's a lot of issues in regards to, again, sort of the work that they're allowed to do. But even there, like they have like a place in society and hold like actually a very important spiritual role. Um, just like in, many other cultures across the globe, thinking of two-spirit people who hold also, I think, uh, special shamanic or religious
Yeah.
um, um, power or place or and I think that's wonderful and exciting and because it to me that means that those that we are celebrated
Yeah.
in some way, even if it's maybe limited or whatnot, still you're seen and society has a place for you. And a lot of times I think, especially in the US, especially in places that are not like San Francisco, I think a lot of trans people feel like there is no place for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that forces like I know a lot of trans women even here, trans people, but I think trans women specifically who are like don't like to leave their homes because they, you know, they feel good about being able to sort of like control like how the world sees them through
Yeah.
like social media or through whatever, but like, feel both, uncomfortable and in danger and sort of lost in when trying to move or navigate through like society.
Yeah. I mean, that's like a whole other subject
Yeah.
that I could get into about like visibility. And I've been talking to my partner about that a lot too, around like non-binary people and just like the gender expansiveness within people. Like there's so much more on the other side once we open that up to like seeing the full joy of gender and to see the uniqueness of every person. Like that's what I love about queer people is that they are themselves. We are them ourselves. Yeah.
I know. Yeah, that's really true. Yeah, and we have to fight to be. I think in some ways it feels like a rite of passage, which I think is important.
Yeah.
Um, I think that it when you sort of like earn the right to be yourself, like you, I think are able to really appreciate that and celebrate that and in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, that being said, like, that's not an excuse for like the dehumanization that's happening right now.
Yeah.
It's um and the scapegoating and all of the things that I think are really not only, hurtful for queer and trans people, but like when you do, I mean, I think when you scapegoat a community, ultimately what you're doing is distracting
Right.
from
Yeah.
the actual issues, the things that actually need to be solved and fixed in order to have like a thriving society or to meet the needs of the working class and the poor, I was really fascinated. I don't know, I think it was the Miss Universe pageant where I don't remember if it was Argentina or another country where I think there's a woman who is I believe 60 years old who is like the new Miss like again. Yeah, I don't remember if it's Argentina or if it's another country. I don't think it's Brazil. Um, but I think that's really amazing and incredible because and I think in one of her interviews, she said something like, we need to show that, a woman a woman's worth is beyond her age, and like, even her ability to have children, like, or whatever it might be, like, we are not only productive members of society at all ages, but like necessary, right?
Yeah.
Um, and we can be beautiful at any stage of our lives, and that should be embraced and celebrated. And the person who you know owns the Miss Universe pageant, who sort of opened the door to like allow for people of any age to qualify as a Miss Universe, is a trans woman from China.
Oh.
Yeah. So like, I think that I think it just like I think expanding upon you know concepts of gender are wonderful in and of themselves and have benefit in and of itself, like has benefit in and of itself, but also I think opens the door to so many other things in a really positive and incredible way.
Yeah.
To see the world more broadly and to sort of, question, I think preconceived notions and definitions of work, both self-identity and work.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. On here, I have a question that's like, what do people get wrong about gender? And I feel like you kind of answered that by like talking about the expansiveness. Like for me, I feel like everyone needs to go through a queer journey because you find yourself after that. And like, even if you're not queer, straight people can go through that too. And like, I I feel like I have a superpower because of my queerness, because I had to go through that self exploration that a lot of folks don't do.
Yeah. No, that's I think that's incredibly powerful and totally true. I mean, I think that's why so many people oftentimes feel lost because
Yeah.
they just sort of did what society told them to do, and they come to a point in their life where they realize that something is missing, or like that they don't know who they are, and they go through a midlife crisis, and it's because I think that they haven't done the work to really question, like, who am I? What do I want? Like, how do I fit into this world? They've just always been told that and accepted it,
Yeah.
and that can be, I think fulfilling, or maybe even nice, but oftentimes not forever. At some point you are like, because of life is what it is, you are challenged and put in a position where you're made to feel uncomfortable or unsure, and you know unless you have that really strong foundation that is like tested and true,
Yeah.
you oftentimes falter. So I think people can definitely recover and come out of that, right, and go through their own journeys later in life whenever they figure it out. But I think as queer people, we're sort of forced into that position, when we come out.
Yeah. Absolutely. Turning to resilience, because we obviously are in an interesting world today. The last question that I always ask everyone in this podcast is, how do you stay sane in this wild world?
That's a great question. I mean, I think I've always struggled with being, um, maybe, I don't know if overly ambitious is the right word. I think it's just that I'm always like I always try and set limits for myself of what I can do, or, what I can participate in. And I never keep state of those. I always try and do like 10 million things at the same time, which makes me feel overwhelmed and like not practice the best self-care. But I think in the last year, I think after actually in my transition from my previous job to this job, like I really made it a point, I think, to start going to the gym every morning. Even if it means waking up at like 5:30 a.m. or whatever, to like, so that I have time to like get ready for my day. Just taking that time to like care for my body and my health um feels really good. And also like makes me feel less anxious about other things, and pace myself a little bit more. Um so that has been the way in which lately I've been doing self-care. Also, like, I'm in a band, my band Commando. It's a new metal group. Getting to make music is also another way I think that yes, it's in some ways work, or, being productive and producing, I guess, but it's also incredibly healing. I think there was a study or a report that came out of BBC recently that, singing, and specifically singing in groups, is actually
Yeah.
really, really healing for people. And like, as somebody who grew up like singing choir, I think from the third grade all the way through high school and like being involved in musicals and doing all these things throughout college, etc. Like I've always found that to be really true. Music is an incredibly like unique thing that we do as humans.
Yeah.
Not, we're not the only animals that do it, but like we just do it really, really incredibly well.
Yeah.
And there's a magic to, I think, collectively coming together to create something beautiful like that, just for the pleasure of doing it.
I love that. I've done a lot of singing too recently because it does a lot for the body too with its somatics. Like
Mm-hmm.
I've been doing a lot of like meditative singing and dancing because it
Mm-hmm.
does so much releasing of like your body and your emotion. So I love that, and that feels very like true to the queer Indigenous culture that we're talking about today.
Yeah.
I really appreciate talking with you today, and I had a really good time geeking out with you.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. It's always a pleasure. And yeah, always love to talk to you.
Yeah.